U.S. retail sales ticked up 1% in June, but as consumers face decades-high inflation, what can retailers expect in the coming months? For more on that, let's bring in Elizabeth Ebert, CIO of the advisory partner for CPG, Retail and Logistics at Infosys Consulting. Good to see you again. As we look at these numbers, and I also look at the consumer confidence number that we just got, the preliminary number from the University of Michigan coming in a little better than estimated. What are these numbers telling you about, or what are they reflecting about what we're seeing in underlying consumer spending?
Yeah, good morning. The real story here is just the resilience of the U.S. consumer. We've seen it even beginning with COVID and quarantine. Now we're seeing continued spending and a willingness to engage and open wallets coming right through the concerns about inflation and recession. So I think it's a great relief to retail companies. Certainly my retail clients are very interested in these numbers, particularly because we're just on the cusp of the very important back to school season and then getting into the holidays. So the primary concern is getting too deep a hole from any of these other economic headwinds. And I think everyone's really relieved that we're seeing such strength, though really weighing heavily on my clients and our retail relationships minds is what to do with all this inventory.
Elizabeth, I was talking to one well-known CEO in retail last night, and he was telling me that it's pretty dreadful out there. Those were his words, not mine. Because of a lot of inventory and really starting to see a pickup in the level of discounting in malls, in other stores. How many quarters will it take to get through this inventory, you think?
Well, it all depends on what the response is and how much discounting can really trigger an increase in consumer spending. I mean, it depends on who you are, in terms of how dreadful it is. If you're the CFO, you're going to see these, these promotions really eating into margin. As your prior guest said, margin is going to really take a beating in terms of this cycle. If you're a store associate, it is a really dreadful time. Where the retailers are understaffed in general, and now they've got this tremendous amount of merchandise in stores that needs to be managed and hopefully pushed out. And at the same time, they've got all of their back to school items coming in. And before we know it, Christmas and holiday shopping will be in. So where the rubber meets the road as an associate, it is also truly a terrible time. As a consumer, as we see the increases in promotions, we've had Amazon Prime Day this week. I think that's taken on a new flavor as basically a national shopping event. We're seeing just broad-based 30% off, 40% off discounts on websites, on all the merchandise. So great time to be a consumer, which is coming off of last Christmas, last holiday season, where consumers were complaining bitterly that there weren't a lot of good deals. So, folks, now here are your good deals.
Here are your good deals. I'm curious if we're back to the old regime. In other words, we were talking about this a little bit yesterday, that pre-pandemic, the discounting regime was firmly in place and had been for years, where you walked into, particularly an apparel retailer, you were expected to see discounts. And then the pandemic sort of swept that away for a while. Are we back permanently once again to sort of perennial discounts that they're always sort of around?
I'm an IT consultant, and I help my clients be more responsive in terms of how they can engage the consumer and change store experiences. So what I think is going to happen is this. Retailers are really investing in terms of their intelligence about where sales are going, what their supply chain issues might be in terms of any gaps, any increases in inventory. So I think we're going to see retailers being able to respond in new ways because of improvements in the data and things like artificial intelligence. They're going to, give them heads up that they've got inventory problems coming, they've got shortages coming, whatever the case may be. So I think successful retailers moving forward are really going to be much more responsive, be able to really sense any ripples in their entire ecosystem and be able to adjust with different types of merchandising assortments, different pricing strategies, being able to sort of hyper specialize or hyper personalize messages for individual and segments of consumers. So I think it's going to be a really interesting time, and retailers who are able to sort of capture that intelligence and sense and respond are really going to win the game.
Elizabeth, I assume you can't comment specifically on a Target, but an example like Target, is that an example of what you're saying? or is that the opposite? In other words, it seemed like Target, it felt abrupt, right? But at the same time, they were being very dramatic and responsive to the environment out there, maybe using the data, some of the data like you're talking about. So are we going to see more like that as a result?
I think it's a great message on how important sort of the sense and respond reflex needs to be with retailers. That may have felt abrupt for us as consumers or in the media, but I think many of my clients and for those of us who spend a lot of time with supply chain and demand forecasting, I think we were all expecting this just in terms of the way the supply chain issues were rippling through, the uncertainty. You know, most of these companies depend on consumer behavior models that have been in place for years, if not decades. And now all of those are basically out the window. And even with this, current cycle, there's a lot of learning in terms of how our consumers are responding that may not entirely be too valuable for retailers moving forward. They like slow and steady or consistent and steady anyway. And this is anything but consistent. So Target's been very aggressive in their response, appropriately so. My guess is they saw this coming. They're probably trying to do some things to avoid, really hard to avoid when you've got to make merchandising buys months in advance, when inflation kind of, comes at us, hot and heavy. So I think they're doing the best they can. But moving forward, I think everyone in retail and consumer goods and consumer markets really is seeing how important data and responses are moving forward.
Elizabeth Ebert, CIO Advisory Partner for CPG, Retail and Logistics at Infosys Consulting. Good to see you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.